Eastern Front, winter 1943. The sky is gray, heavy with snow and smoke. Below, a frozen battlefield stretches endlessly. Broken tanks, blackened forests, and lines of exhausted men. High above, a single aircraft dives through the clouds amidst engines screaming, guns flashing. It's not a sleek Spitfire or a powerful Mustang. It's the Bell P-39 Airacobra, the American fighter that pilots once mocked, engineers almost abandoned, and generals wrote off as a failure. But here, in Soviet hands, it has become something else. The low whine of its engine cuts through the cold air as it tears into a formation of German bombers. One bursts into flame, another spins out of the sky. On the ground, Soviet soldiers look up and cheer. Few of them know this strange machine was once called America's worst. What they see is a survivor, fast, deadly, and perfect for the brutal war they're fighting. This is the story of how a failed experiment became a legend. In the years before World War II, the skies were still a place of experimentation. The United States was watching Europe race ahead. Germany's Luftwaffe was growing stronger by the day, and Britain's Royal Air Force was already testing the limits of modern flight. America, still recovering from the Great Depression, was behind. Its Air Force, then called the U.S. Army Air Corps, flew outdated planes, slow and fragile, built for a war that no longer existed. But in 1937, a small company in Buffalo, New York called Bell Aircraft Corporation believed it could change that. Led by an ambitious engineer named Larry Bell, the team began sketching a fighter so radical it didn't look like anything else in the sky. They called it the P-39 Airacobra. The concept was bold. Instead of placing the engine in the nose, Bell's engineers mounted it behind the pilot, in the middle of the fuselage, something almost no one had done before. This allowed them to install a powerful 37mm cannon that fired straight through the propeller hub. On paper, it was a genius design. A fighter that could destroy bombers with one shot and outclimb anything in the air. The Airacobra looked fast, modern, and deadly. Early prototypes reached speeds above 380 miles per hour, stunning test pilots. The U.S. Army placed orders quickly, hoping it would be America's answer to the Messerschmitt Bf-109. But as with many great ideas, the details hit a fatal flaw. The plane's heart, its Allison V1710 engine, lacked a turbocharger. It could fly well at low altitudes, but as it climbed higher, its power dropped sharply. The Airacobra, designed to be a high-altitude interceptor, suddenly became nearly useless above 15,000 feet. When war broke out in Europe, American pilots tested the Airacobra in real conditions. It looked sleek on the runway, but struggled where it mattered most, in the thin air where dogfights were won and lost. By 1941, the British Royal Air Force received their first shipment under Lend-Lease. Their verdict was brutal. One British report called it unsuitable for combat against the Luftwaffe. Pilots complained that it climbed slowly, lost power fast, and handled poorly at high altitude. Some units refused to fly it at all. Word spread quickly through Allied ranks. The P-39 was laughed at, a flying disappointment, an aircraft unfit for war. British squadrons sent most of their Airacobras back to the United States. American test commands quietly shifted attention to other designs like the P-40 Warhawk and the developing P-51 Mustang. Inside Bell Aircraft, morale collapsed. Engineers who had once dreamed of revolutionizing fighter design were now reading scathing reports from overseas. They tried to modify the plane, adding weight here, changing propellers there, but nothing could fix the missing turbocharger. Still, the U.S. Army couldn't afford to waste production. Hundreds of Airacobras were already built and thousands more were planned. The question was simple: what do we do with them? As America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, priorities shifted fast. The Airacobra was pushed aside, given to training units or sent overseas through the Lend-Lease program, to Britain, Australia, and eventually, the Soviet Union. It was in that unlikely exchange that the story began to turn. The Americans saw a failed high-altitude interceptor. The Soviets saw something else entirely: a low-altitude, heavily armed killer that could thrive in the brutal, close-range air battles of the Eastern Front. Where others saw weakness, they saw potential. Soon, crates of rejected Airacobras began crossing the Pacific, under secret supply routes to Vladivostok, where Soviet engineers examined them carefully. They smiled. For their kind of war, fast, low, and deadly, this strange American machine might just work. When the first Bell P-39 Airacobras arrived in the Soviet Union in late 1941, few outside the Red Army Air Force paid attention. The world still saw the plane as a failure, a second-rate fighter being shipped off to desperate allies. But in the Soviet Union, where the air war looked very different, the story was about to change. The Eastern Front wasn't a place for high-altitude duels. Here the fighting happened low, sometimes below 10,000 feet, where the sky met the smoke and chaos of the battlefield. Planes had to attack tanks, trains, and columns of troops at point-blank range. It was a brutal, dirty, close-in kind of combat. For that kind of war, the Airacobra's supposed weaknesses became strengths. Its mid-mounted engine gave it a tight center of gravity, meaning it could turn sharply and stay stable even when diving or pulling hard in combat. Its heavy nose cannon, the 37mm M4, could rip through enemy aircraft or armored vehicles with a single shot. And without the high-altitude turbocharger, the engine performed exactly where Soviet pilots needed it most, low to the ground. Soviet test pilots quickly realized they had something special. One of them, Stepan Suprun, a decorated hero of the Soviet Union, praised the Airacobra's precision handling and firepower. Others followed. Soon, elite Soviet squadrons, including the 9th Guards Fighter Regiment, began flying the P-39. It didn't take long for results to appear. By mid-1942, German pilots on the Eastern Front began reporting strange new American-made fighters appearing over the front lines. Fast, low, and armed with cannons that could destroy anything they hit. The Luftwaffe initially dismissed them as obsolete exports. But when German aircraft started falling in alarming numbers, attitudes changed. The Soviets, in their typical style, pushed the aircraft to its limits. They stripped unnecessary equipment to make it lighter, fine-tuned its guns, and used it for aggressive low-altitude strikes. They even painted personal markings, red stars and kill tallies, across the olive-green American fuselages. For the Americans, this success was almost invisible. The U.S. military had moved on, focusing on the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. The Airacobra became a footnote in Western reports, mentioned only as export equipment. But in Soviet hands, it was rewriting air combat doctrine. Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin, who would become the second highest scoring Allied fighter ace of World War II, flew the P-39 almost exclusively. He credited the plane with saving his life multiple times and called it a weapon perfectly suited for our skies. Pokrishkin would go on to achieve 59 confirmed victories, most of them in Airacobras, making him the top P-39 ace in history. By 1943, the aircraft that had been mocked in Britain and sidelined in America had become a symbol of Soviet air power. Over 4,700 Airacobras were delivered through Lend-Lease, more than to any other Allied nation. They flew in some of the fiercest air battles of the war, from Stalingrad to Kursk, hunting bombers, strafing tanks, and providing cover for advancing Soviet troops. The American engineers at Bell Aircraft began to hear rumors from the front. The Soviets were raving about the plane. It could outturn German Bf-109s at low altitude, hit hard, and take punishment. Bell's designers couldn't help but feel vindicated. Still, back home, the Airacobra's reputation remained stuck. It was America's worst fighter, the one that never lived up to expectations. But history has a way of rewarding the misunderstood. Because while the U.S. was focusing on high-altitude strategic bombing, the Soviets were showing the world something different, that victory in the air didn't always come from speed or altitude. It came from adaptability, from turning a flawed machine into the perfect tool for survival. The Airacobra was never the best, but in the right hands it was unstoppable. The story of the P-39 Airacobra isn't just about metal and machinery, it's about people. The pilots who flew it, the engineers who defended it, and the critics who mocked it. In 1941, when America entered the war, every pilot wanted to fly the best. The skies were full of new legends, the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and Britain's elegant Spitfire. The Airacobra, with its strange mid-engine layout and clunky looks, felt like a misfit among giants. American pilots joked about it. They called it the flying coffin or the iron dog. Some refused to fly it at all. The Army Air Forces quietly pushed it aside, assigning most of them to training roles or sending them off to allies who could use anything with wings. But inside the Bell aircraft plant in Buffalo, New York, a small group of engineers refused to give up. They knew what the Airacobra could do, if only someone would fly it the right way. It wasn't built to soar at 30,000 feet or dogfight at high altitude. It was built for something rougher, more personal, low-level fighting where skill and nerve mattered more than speed. When the Soviets began sending back reports, those engineers read every word like a victory. They learned that in Russia, pilots were calling the Airacobra Kobrushka, Little Cobra. It was loved, not mocked. Soviet flyers were pulling off tight turns just a few feet above the ground, striking enemy columns, and shooting down German fighters that had once dominated the skies. It was proof that a bad plane could still win a war if it found the right battlefield. Meanwhile, for American pilots still stuck with the Airacobra in the Pacific and Mediterranean, opinions were divided. Some hated it for its limited ceiling and short range, but others began to notice its strengths. In the jungles of New Guinea, where dogfights happened under the clouds, pilots found that the P-39's 37mm cannon could obliterate Japanese bombers in a single shot. Its sturdy frame could take damage and keep flying, something that often meant the difference between life and death. Still, the press at home never told that side of the story. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating Mustangs and Thunderbolts, not the little plane that had been exported to the farthest corners of the war. To most Americans, the Airacobra remained an embarrassment, a design that never lived up to its promise. But on the other side of the world, Soviet mechanics were painting red stars on their Airacobras, carving kill tallies into the fuselage, and calling it their guardian angel. For the Soviet pilots, it wasn't just another aircraft. It was a partner in survival. Many of them flew multiple missions a day in freezing weather, often landing on dirt strips barely long enough to stop. The P-39's reliable engine and heavy firepower gave them an edge, and the courage to go again and again. They respected it not for what it couldn't do, but for what it could. That difference in mindset, rejection in America, mastery in Russia, became the heart of the Airacobra's strange legacy. It showed that a plane's value wasn't fixed by design or reputation. It was decided by the people who flew it, and the world they fought in. A failure in one sky, a hero in another. Every aircraft tells two stories, one in the engineering room and one in the cockpit. The P-39 Airacobra was no exception. From the moment it was rolled out, the Airacobra was a machine built around an idea that most designers considered insane, putting the engine in the middle of the plane, behind the pilot. It was revolutionary. Bell Aircraft believed this layout would improve balance, give the pilot better visibility, and allow space in the nose for a massive 37mm cannon, a weapon that could tear apart tanks or bombers in a single hit. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was chaos. The mid-engine design created constant cooling problems. The long drive shaft that ran under the cockpit made some pilots nervous. They joked that if it snapped, it would saw the pilot in half. And without a turbo supercharger, the P-39's Allison engine simply couldn't perform at high altitude. To airmen used to dueling in thin skies, it felt like a step backward. But to the Soviet Air Force fighting at treetop level over the Eastern Front, it was perfect. Their missions rarely went above 10,000 feet. They needed a fast, rugged aircraft that could strike hard and turn quickly. The Airacobra's flaws in the West became strengths in the East. Ace pilot Alexander Pokrishkin, one of the most respected names in Soviet aviation, was among the first to see its potential. He flew it like a scalpel, using its low-altitude agility and heavy cannon to cut through German formations. He scored dozens of kills in the Airacobra, rewriting the tactics manual for Soviet fighters. He once said, "It fits me like a glove. At low height, no German plane can escape me." That single line changed how Soviet commanders viewed the aircraft. Soon, entire regiments were equipped with the P-39. Mechanics learned its quirks. Pilots developed special takeoff techniques for icy airstrips. They treated the machine with care, like a loyal animal that demanded respect but paid it back in kind. Even its tricycle landing gear, which American pilots found awkward, became a blessing on muddy Eastern Front runways. Where other aircraft flipped or bogged down, the Airacobra stood firm. Meanwhile, in America, Bell engineers followed every field report coming back from Russia. They were stunned by how successful the aircraft had become in conditions where U.S. pilots had once complained. Those reports weren't just statistics, they were redemption letters, and they carried lessons for the next generation of American aircraft. The Airacobra's engine placement inspired future designs with central mass balance. Its 37mm cannon proved that heavy nose-mounted guns could dominate air-to-air combat. Even the layout of its car-style side doors, mocked early on, influenced how later aircraft improved cockpit access and emergency ejection systems. But beyond mechanics and data, there was something deeper, a human connection between American builders and Soviet flyers, separated by distance but united by necessity. Photographs show Bell's factory workers signing messages on the fuselage panels before shipment. "Good luck, boys. Give 'em hell," from Buffalo to Berlin. Thousands of these planes, painted olive drab and bearing red stars, made the dangerous trip across Alaska and Siberia through the Lend-Lease program. Each flight risked storms, freezing temperatures, and enemy interception. Many never arrived, but those that did became part of a silent bond between two nations, one designing in theory, the other proving in blood. For the Soviet pilots, that bond mattered. They often referred to their Airacobras by nickname like Cobra Masha or Little Bitch, both affectionate and fierce. They decorated them with personal art, shark's teeth, red flames, patriotic slogans. In a brutal war where life expectancy could be counted in weeks, that small act of ownership meant everything. The Airacobra was no longer America's worst fighter. It had become the symbol of adaptation, trust, and survival. A machine that proved brilliance can come from failure, and that the front line, not the factory, decides what works. And as the eastern skies grew darker with German bombers, the world was about to see how this misunderstood plane, and the men who flew it, would change the air war forever. Eastern Front, spring 1943. The Battle of Kuban was raging. German bombers swarmed across the sky, their engines echoing like thunder over the Black Sea. Below, Soviet convoys tried to move supplies through a wasteland of mud and smoke. The air war had become a daily fight for survival. In those skies, the Bell P-39 Airacobra, the so-called failed American fighter, was about to earn its redemption. The Soviets had organized their air defenses into tight, disciplined formations. Among them was the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, led by a young but already legendary pilot, Alexander Pokrishkin. His aircraft bore the red star of the USSR and the white letters 100 on its side, a mark of pride. Inside, the cockpit was cramped and shaking, the engine roaring just inches behind his seat. But he trusted this machine more than any he'd flown before. That morning, German Messerschmitt Bf 109s cut through the clouds, escorting a wave of bombers. They expected the same easy dominance they had enjoyed early in the war, when Soviet fighters had been slow, clumsy, and uncoordinated. But this time something was different. Pokrishkin and his men didn't climb to meet them. They stayed low, hidden in the haze. The Airacobra's Allison engine thrived in dense air near the ground. Its maneuverability was unmatched at low altitude, and its 37mm cannon could destroy a bomber with one hit. When the German formation passed overhead, the Soviets pulled up sharply, rising from the mist like ghosts. The sky exploded. Pokrishkin fired first. One short burst. The cannon shell struck a Heinkel bomber square in the fuselage, tearing it apart. The debris rained down like burning snow. His wingman, Grigory Reshkalov, followed with a tight roll, firing at a Messerschmitt trying to dive away. 2 hits, and the German fighter spun into the earth. Within minutes, the enemy formation scattered. The Airacobras chased them relentlessly, twisting through the air in maneuvers no German pilot expected from such a clumsy American design. In the chaos, radio chatter filled the headsets and were clipped, urgent, filled with adrenaline. Soviet ground troops below paused to watch, cheering as trails of smoke spiraled across the gray morning sky. By the end of that single engagement, the regiment claimed more than a dozen enemy aircraft destroyed, at the cost of only one Airacobra. Pokrishkin himself downed 2 planes that day, bringing his tally closer to the top of Soviet records. It wasn't just a victory, it was a message. The Germans, who once mocked the Airacobra as a low-altitude nuisance, began to fear it. Reports from Luftwaffe squadrons described green-nosed fighters attacking with terrifying precision. They noted the heavy cannon that could destroy an aircraft in one hit, and the strange, fast-rolling maneuver that no German plane could match below 5,000 feet. Soon, the Eastern Front air war began to shift. The Soviets now had confidence, and confidence was everything. From Stalingrad to Kursk, Airacobra units became the backbone of low-altitude defense and attack. They struck supply lines, escorted bombers, and cut down German aircraft trying to retreat. For the first time, Soviet pilots could take control of the sky on their own terms, and at the center of it all was a machine once laughed at by its own creators. Pokrishkin's reputation soared alongside it. He would go on to become one of the highest-scoring Allied aces of the entire war. Most of his victories achieved in the Airacobra. He even redefined Soviet air combat tactics, emphasizing coordinated attacks and flexible formations that turned the tide against superior German aircraft. His squadron's motto became a quiet symbol across the Eastern Front: speed, altitude, maneuver, fire. 4 words that captured everything the Airacobra could do when flown by men who understood its heart. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because soon, as the front lines pushed westward and the Allies prepared for their own massive offensives, the lessons learned from this strange aircraft would inspire a revolution in American fighter design itself. By late 1943, word of the Airacobra's success on the Eastern Front began to filter back to the United States. Quietly, almost disbelievingly. Reports from Soviet commanders described kill ratios that seemed impossible. Photographs showed lines of Airacobras parked on snow-covered airfields, each marked with rows of victory stars. To American engineers and officers, it was both humbling and electrifying. The aircraft that had been mocked in U.S. service was now rewriting the rules of aerial combat overseas. Inside Bell Aircraft's plant in Buffalo, production didn't slow. It surged. More than 9,500 P-39s rolled out of the assembly lines. Over half of them shipped to the Soviet Union through the treacherous Alaska-Siberia route, where freezing winds and engine failures claimed dozens of ferry pilots. Yet the mission continued. The Soviets wanted more. For Bell's engineers, the message was clear. Their controversial design had found its purpose. And for American tacticians, it sparked a revelation. That innovation wasn't about perfection, but adaptation. At the same time, U.S. pilots fighting in the Pacific and Mediterranean began rethinking their judgment. Some squadrons reintroduced the P-39 in ground attack roles, strafing Japanese convoys or destroying German supply lines. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was critical. The aircraft's low-altitude firepower, once considered excessive, became a strength in these brutal, close-range missions. Even those who still disliked the Airacobra began to respect it. Its 37mm cannon could blow apart a bunker. Its mid-engine layout made it incredibly stable in dives, and its tricycle landing gear, initially ridiculed, was now seen as a feature ahead of its time. But the Airacobra's greatest impact wasn't just in combat. It was in what it taught the next generation of designers, American engineers studying its combat. Data realized that the P-39's failures had revealed what future fighters needed most: power at altitude, aerodynamic efficiency, and endurance. That research directly influenced the development of the P-63 King Cobra, a refined successor that fixed many of the original design's flaws and contributed insights used in the creation of the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would go on to dominate the final years of the war. Ironically, without the Airacobra's shortcomings, that leap forward might never have happened. On the Soviet side, the aircraft's influence ran deeper. Pilots like Pokrishkin, Rechkalov, and Glinka had built their legends flying the P-39. They rewrote the book on low-altitude combat, teaching young aviators to fight smart, not high. Their successes changed Soviet doctrine, emphasizing precision strikes and aggressive forward air power that later defined the Red Air Force's style well into the Cold War. In fact, many of these aces kept flying Airacobras until the very end of the war, even after newer models arrived. They trusted the machine that had kept them alive in the hardest years, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The United States, with its advanced industry and endless innovation, had dismissed the Airacobra as unsuitable for combat. Yet, on the other side of the world, it became a cornerstone of victory against the German Luftwaffe. When Allied leaders met in 1944 to discuss strategies for final victory, few realized that one of the quiet heroes of that war wasn't a tank or a bomber. It was a small, misunderstood fighter that refused to be forgotten. In the end, the Airacobra's story was more than the redemption of a design. It was the redemption of an idea, that no creation is useless if it finds the right hands. As the Soviets marched toward Berlin and the Allies advanced across Europe, the lessons of the P-39 echoed through every new aircraft that took to the skies. Build boldly. Adapt relentlessly. Trust the people who fly. Because in war, as the Airacobra had proved, what others laugh at today can define victory tomorrow. When the war finally began to fade, the skies above Europe and the Pacific grew quiet. But the legend of the P-39 Airacobra did not. In the wreckage of cities and the silence of airfields, stories of the little fighter spread through both Allied and Soviet camps. The aircraft that America had once dismissed as a design mistake had become one of the most effective Allied fighters of the Eastern Front. By 1945, more than 4,700 German aircraft had been shot down by Soviet pilots flying Airacobras. Some of the highest-scoring Allied aces of the entire war, men like Alexander Pokrishkin, 59 confirmed victories, and Grigory Rechkalov, 56 victories, achieved nearly all of their kills in the cockpit of this machine. To them, the P-39 wasn't just a plane, it was a weapon of survival, an aircraft that had given them a fighting chance in a sky once ruled by the Luftwaffe. At Soviet air bases, mechanics who had spent years repairing bullet holes and cracked engines began painting farewell messages on the fuselages. Spasibo, Cobra, thank you, Cobra. The aircraft had earned its respect not through perfection but through persistence. In America, the story was different, quieter, almost forgotten. The press moved on to celebrate the shining heroes of the air war: the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the B-17 Flying Fortress. The Airacobra was rarely mentioned. It didn't fit the image of American air superiority that the post-war world wanted to remember. But inside the hangars of Bell aircraft, the engineers knew what they had accomplished. They had taken a radical idea, the mid-engine fighter, and proved that unconventional thinking could lead to extraordinary results. The design principles they experimented with in the P-39 later appeared in jets and attack aircraft across the world. The aircraft's story also lived on in the Lend-Lease program, which became a symbol of cooperation between two very different nations. Over 4,700 Airacobras were delivered to the USSR, a logistical miracle carried out over 10,000 miles of frozen wilderness. American ferry pilots who made that journey never forgot it. The endless ice, the bitter winds, the knowledge that one mistake meant vanishing forever in the Siberian snow. To the Soviets, those deliveries were more than hardware. They were hope. By 1945, the Airacobra had fought in nearly every major Soviet offensive from Stalingrad to Berlin. It had provided ground cover for tanks at Kursk, escorted bombers over the Dnieper River, and hunted German fighters above the ruins of Warsaw. Wherever it went, it left a mark. Soviet archives from the time describe pilots returning from missions with their planes riddled by bullets, landing on one wheel, engines smoking, but alive. The mechanics would shake their heads, patch up the aluminum, and send the same aircraft back out the next morning. It was that kind of war, and that kind of airplane. In the months after Germany's surrender, many Airacobras were still flying. Some became training planes. Others were used to patrol vast stretches of Soviet territory. A few were dismantled and studied, their parts helping to shape the designs of early jet aircraft. In America, the P-39 faded quietly from active service. It was replaced by faster, sleeker machines, but it left behind an important lesson for a generation of engineers who had watched its strange story unfold. Innovation is never linear. Sometimes progress comes disguised as failure. And for the men who had built, flown, and trusted the Airacobra, that truth was written in the skies it conquered. As the world shifted from war to uneasy peace, the Bell P-39 Airacobra quietly slipped out of service. No grand retirement ceremony, no parades, just a slow fade into the background of history, replaced by faster jets and sleeker prop fighters that carried the glory of victory. But in hangars, museums, and memories across the world, its shadow remained. For the Soviets, the Airacobra became part of legend. Veteran pilots spoke of it with a rare mix of affection and reverence. In memoirs published years later, Alexander Pokrishkin described the aircraft not as a tool of war, but as a comrade. He credited it for giving him the precision and confidence to outthink German aces who once dominated the skies. When asked decades later about his success, Pokrishkin famously said, "The plane didn't fight the war, the man did. But the Cobra gave us the teeth." That sentiment echoed across generations of pilots. Soviet flight schools in the late 1940s still used modified Airacobras to train cadets. Some were kept flying deep into the 1950s, long after they were considered obsolete elsewhere. Each surviving machine carried scars, patched bullet holes, faded markings, the ghost of a red star half hidden under new paint. In the United States, the P-39 story took longer to be told. It had been overshadowed by America's more glamorous aircraft, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts that won the headlines. For years, the Airacobra was remembered mostly as a failed experiment. But slowly, as aviation historians dug deeper into Soviet combat reports, a new picture emerged. What America called failure, the Eastern Front called victory. The numbers spoke for themselves. Over 9,500 units produced, making it one of the most mass-produced American fighters of the war. More than half of them used by Soviet forces, a testament to trust and necessity. Some of the highest Allied kill ratios of the entire war achieved in its cockpit. By the 1970s and 1980s, Western historians began to recognize the truth, that the P-39 had been one of the most important fighters of World War II, not for what it was supposed to do, but for what it ended up doing. And in that realization lay one of the war's quietest ironies. An aircraft rejected by the U.S. Army Air Forces had gone on to help one of America's allies win its most brutal battles. In post-war reunions, the few surviving Bell engineers often spoke about that twist of fate. They had designed something bold, misunderstood it, watched it be dismissed, and then learned it had saved lives halfway across the world. It was both humbling and profoundly moving. For them, the Airacobra represented a deeper kind of victory, not of nations, but of ideas. It proved that innovation often looks strange at first, that being different doesn't mean being wrong, and that sometimes the most mocked creation can end up changing history in ways no one expects. Today, a handful of restored P-39s still fly in air shows, their smooth, compact shapes gleaming in the sun, engines humming behind the pilot's seat. Crowds watch them with curiosity, unaware that these small, unassuming planes once tore through battlefields, shaping the fate of nations. At those moments, the laughter of the skeptics feels distant. What remains is the sound of a propeller slicing through the wind, steady, defiant, and proud. Because even decades after the war, the Airacobra's story still carries a quiet truth. In the long arc of history, success isn't always measured in headlines or medals. Sometimes it's measured in survival, in the courage to keep flying when no one believes you can. The story of the P-39 Airacobra is more than a tale of a fighter plane. It is a story about perception, adaptation, and the unexpected paths of history. When it first rolled off the assembly line, it was mocked. Called America's worst fighter, it was dismissed by pilots and generals alike. Its quirks, flaws, and unconventional design seemed to mark it as a failure. And for a time, that was all it was. But history is rarely kind to absolutes. In the hands of those who understood it, the Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front, the Airacobra became a weapon of precision and survival. Its low-altitude agility, heavy firepower, and rugged reliability turned ridicule into respect, doubt into victory. It was never perfect, but it was exactly what the war needed in the places where skill, courage, and adaptability mattered more than speed or prestige. The Airacobra reminds us that innovation does not always follow the path we expect. Sometimes what looks like failure is only misunderstood potential. Sometimes a creation dismissed at home can find purpose elsewhere. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from perfection, but from persistence and adaptation. Today, when we see a restored P-39 gliding through the sky at air shows, we are witnessing more than a machine. We are witnessing the echo of courage, the pilots who trusted it, the engineers who believed in it, and the history it quietly shaped. Its story teaches a simple, enduring lesson. Human creativity and resilience often triumph where certainty fails. And what the world laughs at today may very well become the tool that changes everything tomorrow. The Airacobra may have started as America's underdog, but in the end it soared far beyond expectations. A reminder that even the most unlikely hero can leave a mark on history.